So we'll be talking about Beggar Thy Neighbor by Charles R. Geist. Originally published in 2013, this book traces the changing perceptions of usury from the early Middle Ages all the way up until the recent financial crises. This is a comprehensive economic history that analyzes humanity's attempts to both curb the abuse of debt while also reaping the benefits of credit. Beggar Thy Neighbor examines major debt revolutions of the past, arguing that usury prohibitions continue to play a key role in the banking regulations today, despite modern advances in finance. And so ultimately, we as readers came to an understanding that lending can be a very powerful economic tool that is vital to the development of society, but can also have disastrous effects if left unregulated. So we found that to sort of be the central message of Geist's novel. And overall, we thought that this book seemed like it would be geared most towards scholars, financial historians, anyone with a background or interest in that subject matter.
I thought Geist did a pretty good job with finding good primary and secondary sources to back up his claims. However, I wish he included more direct references throughout the text. Like there was a lot of footnotes like to go back and forth to. So while he does provide the resources and this to go look at those various sources, it was kind of, he would just sometimes say things very vaguely about where they came from.
My quote, something that really stood out to me was how Geist mentioned the use of usury for like the last 3,000 years, and essentially how he took the history of usury from Cicero to now and was able to explain that within his whole novel. And I really liked how he mentioned Albert Einstein at the beginning, saying Albert Einstein repeatedly once marked the compound interest was the eighth wonder of the world. And I just thought that was a really interesting comparison, and especially an interesting choice to use Albert Einstein, because he was involved with math, but you still wouldn't think that he would really have an opinion on usury. And I also just liked how Geist seemed to take more of a stance with the positive elements of usury instead of the negative elements, despite his title of the book, Beggar Thy Neighbor.
It was really interesting to kind of track the ways in which usury was viewed throughout time. And then the fact that Geist takes a positive stance on it, I think overall kind of illustrates how it has come to be viewed today as, even in this quote says, like a necessary evil. It's necessary to our financial functioning in society today.
Like how you mentioned how you wouldn't expect Einstein to be talking, like a mathematician from the 20th century, to be commenting on usury. And I think just kind of goes to show that usury isn't just for people in the finance and economics fields. Like it has a multidisciplinary effect. And that's something Geist talks about. Like he references like ancient philosophers from Greece, and then from people like the financial crisis today.
All right, and then moving on to a passage that I found particularly interesting was this one, which kind of illustrates the foundation of which the sin of usury was understood in Dante's time. As it explains, time was viewed as an asset belonging to God and only God. So by creating something out of nothing, in this case, money out of time, was seen as doing God's work. And this obviously inevitably caused issues within the Catholic Church, which we discussed, and relegated the practice of usury as sinful. So I just found this quote to be particularly relevant to our discussion of both Dante's Inferno and medieval Italy, just to give us like kind of a greater foundation of the understanding of which the sin of usury was built, and then kind of enlightened us to why it was seen as so horrific in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting, like to think about how like the magnitude of how sinful usury is. Because when we first like started like taking Dante's class at the beginning of the semester, I personally wouldn't have thought usury would have been towards like the deepest part of the Inferno, nor would I thought Dante have placed it there. But I think you start to see that there's like ramifications just besides like the financial aspect of usury, and that's why the church was so against it, not necessarily because of its like direct implications, but the more metaphoric aspects.
I think it is kind of interesting though to think about what would have happened in relation to like stances on usury if the church hadn't taken such an involved stance on it, of it being like corrupt and a sin. Like I wonder if things would have been different.
So I thought this passage from Geist was pretty interesting, when she talks about the Florentine bankers and how they were terrified of committing usury, and they didn't want public opinion to think they were committing it. So they took the money that they did actually make from their banking, which technically wasn't usury, but they were still creating profits by holding collateral and transforming the billing system. And they took these funds and they funneled it into art and architecture projects in an attempt to buy forgiveness for potential usury sin, like committing usury. But in the process, I thought that this was kind of like they were committing synonymy, because they were buying themselves forgiveness from the church. So I think it's interesting that although that Dante places usury above synonymy in the Inferno, and the people of Florence were afraid of committing usury, they're committing a worse act in the eyes of Dante.
Kind of going off that, I wonder where Dante, if the Medici family had been alive at the time, like where he would have placed them within the Inferno, since they were such a prominent and basically the most well-known family in Florence for usury.
So we're going to wrap up with some discussion questions. So as I was kind of reading this, and then especially after class on Tuesday, thinking about usury as a sin, it just got me thinking about the ways in which usury could be viewed and with different lenses, whether it's against one's neighbor, one's own self through kind of abuse of reason, or against God, obviously, like we discussed. Or could it also be all three? And then in which this case would it make it kind of like the ultimate violent sin? So I felt like this was just kind of an interesting thought that popped into my head as I was reading, in terms of kind of how to categorize usury.
Now it's not seen as big of a deal, but I understand why it encompasses like all three of those things, like going against one's neighbor, themselves, and God. So I can understand why Dante himself placed users within Circle 7, and especially against the violence against God, because it really was kind of going against the church's morals, essentially.
For my discussion question, I was thinking about if sins like usury and Simonism can be forgiven when they have positive externalities. So ultimately, people who are users are taking advantage of poor people and profiting off of them, and people who commit simony are committing like sins in the eyes of the church, trying to buy themselves forgiveness and prestige and holiness. But again, as we saw with the Medici family, the actions that resulted from their usury and Simonism resulted in like better, more art and better architecture for the people of Florence. So there was benefits for other people, and I was wondering if Dante would forgive people like the Medici.
That almost every sin always has some sort of positive outcome for the person committing it, at least. So it can sometimes be hard to differentiate between whether someone should be forgiven or not based upon how positive these externalities are. But I think in this case, the way we talked about all the different architectural and artistic outcomes that were a result of this sinful activities, maybe not to Dante, but to a lot of us, could see the positive effects, especially now where these practices are pretty commonplace, to kind of understand that a lot of these kind of behaviors are pretty acceptable and can often have pretty beneficial outcomes to the development of society and humanity.
And I think even within the Inferno, I think Dante, when he was in certain circles of hell, he was pretty forgiving towards certain sinners. So I think if maybe he knew that usury wasn't seen in such a bad light now, I feel like he would be willing to forgive them, especially if he saw all the positives that came from it.
overall thoughts on the book?
Yeah, overall, I would give it a thumbs up. I liked the book. I just thought it was really interesting how I said earlier he went from the history from Cicero to now. I think at sometimes he did kind of get a little sidetracked with side issues that kind of like blurred his main story, like talking about debt, but it wasn't really exactly tied in with usury. But I think overall it helped kind of give a solid background to why Dante made the decision he did.
I was gonna say I agree. Because again, like when I first started reading the Inferno, I didn't understand why usury was placed so far deep. But after reading Beggar Thy Neighbor, I have a better understanding for why Dante was so adamantly against the usurers and why he didn't have any pity for them.
I agree with both those points. Then I guess just overall, I always enjoy kind of getting a more of a greater historical lens as to the different phenomenon, both like economic, political, whatever it may be in Dante's time. I think always just kind of gives us a better understanding of what Dante's thoughts were as he was writing the Inferno, and why we see the characters where they are as we do.